All right, so welcome, those of you at mochurch.tv. Welcome to my freaks in person. Good morning. You have to get loud again because they didn't hear you the first time, remember? Yeah, there they are. Man, they're hyped in here. It's a quick roof check. Oh, see, for those of you who don't know, it's how we test the hype level of the crowd. You have to repeat it. Ready? Roof check. That's pretty good. Okay, so welcome, mochurch.tv people. Turn to Psalm 126. You can download the Bible app for free. And I'll be in the New International Version this morning. Not because you care, but I want to share more info than you want to know about me this morning, about my workout schedule. Okay? So I started working out when I was in middle school. I loved it. I go to my basement because it got me away from my mom and stepdad. And I go down there, and I had two albums I rotated. Rocky IV, who doesn't work out to Rocky IV? And Kool Moe Dee's album, How You Like Me Now. And so those were my two alternating, and I would go down there and I'd work out with my plastic weights that came from a Hulk Hogan set or whatever I did. And so now when I work out, I have kind of a routine. And why I want to share this is so you notice something that's not in the routine. And here's my routine. On Mondays, it's my leg day. Tuesdays, it's my day off, and I do a longer workout. I do chest and tris. Wednesday, biceps and back. Thursday is a running day. I run 4 miles. Friday, I do shoulders. Saturday, that's another running day. I run 4 miles. And Sunday, I preach 3 sermons. That honestly exhausts me way more than any other work that I do. But every day, I do abs or some core workout. So now, according to my doctors, this isn't something I can take credit for. It's just something my doctors tell me. They're like, man, you've got a really healthy heart. I remember the first, before I ever ran, I didn't used to be a runner. I was a sprinter. I was a little fast white kid when I was in high school, but I never ran for distance. And I'd go to the doctor, and the doctor would be like, your resting heart rate is so low. Are you a runner? And I'd be like, no, not even close. I hate long-distance running. I still hate it, by the way, on Thursdays and Saturdays. And so he'd be like, man, you've got a really healthy heart, strong heart, like an elephant. Like, sweet. That's hereditary. That's genes, because I didn't do anything for that, so I'm blessed to have that. But one of the things I want you to notice is that I don't have a day where I work in another thing, like shoulders and heart. Like, I don't have a heart day. Which means, I don't have, here's some heart exercises where I'll do 3 sets of 10, and this is directly working out my heart. And I've been thinking about this a lot for a couple years now, is that this is the funny thing. You can't work out your heart directly. Like, speaking of the literal, physical, human heart, you always have to work out your heart indirectly. And so that's what we call cardio or cardiovascular exercises. And to work out your heart, you have to work it out indirectly. And so pretty much when you get a heart workout, really primarily you're working out your legs often because you're running or jogging. You're doing stair steps. You're going for a walk in the neighborhood. You're cycling. Then there's full body ways to get to your heart. Swimming. That's a full body workout, but indirectly you're getting a heart workout, a cardio workout. My best friend from college, his name is Chris Simpson, and Chris, he's paraplegic, so he's paralyzed from his upper thighs down. And so when he wants a cardio workout, it's kind of difficult for him. At some gyms, they have this contraption that I call a hand bike, and I think he calls it that sometimes too, but it's an ergometer. And what you do is it has kind of like pedals almost, but they're handles, and he works out using his arms and his shoulders, and he works up a lather and a sweat. If he wants to do cardio, that's what he has to do to get to his heart. And so it's really interesting to me that the heart is a muscle, and it is something that, it's really beneficial to work it out, because if you strengthen and enlarge your heart muscle, it improves its pumping efficiency, and it reduces your resting heart rate. And so it's really a good thing to work out your heart muscle, but you have to work it out indirectly. You have to work out some other part of your body. You have to get to the heart through the legs, through the arms and shoulders, or through the full body of swimming. So we're in a series that is kind of about a different version of what we call the heart, more metaphorically, and it's a series out of the book of Psalms. Now, I don't have the Catholic background experience that John Mulaney has, who we just heard from. So I can't speak to the Catholic solo type songs that dudes who can't sing, apparently, get up and sing in front of the congregation. that he says these Psalms are not good. Well, I can speak to the book of Psalms in the Bible, 150 Psalms, that are just so good, and I love them so much, and that's what the series is out of. In the book of Psalms, really they go deep into the human heart, not meaning physically, but the inner person. They go deep into your emotions and even the motives of the heart. And so what you have, I'll briefly summarize the intro that I gave last week, is that what you have with the Psalms is a God-honoring, God-given way to deal with your feelings. And so you have basically two options that are normal in the world. There's kind of the religious in kind of the negative sense, and religiosity, where you don't, the way you deal with your feelings is you kind of stuff them or ignore them, because if you think the way you're getting to heaven is by being a good person, if you think that the way to get to heaven and earn God's attention is through your virtues, then you can't really admit what's going on deep down in the recesses of your heart, because you're struggling at times with sadness, pain, despair, anger, all these things. And so you have to kind of stuff that or put that aside and kind of deny those emotions, because you want to convince yourself and God that you're a really good person. You're better than the average Joe, because you want to get to heaven. You want to, hoping God grades on a curve and you make the cut. He doesn't, okay? So that's kind of the religious view. Then there's the secular view, which is more famous in pop culture, which basically says identifying, finding, discovering, and expressing your feelings is almost an end in itself. Like, that is the big deal, is if you find out who you are, this is how I feel, so this is therefore who I am, and if you express that, that's like the thing to be celebrated. So in secular society, you basically bow to your emotions. And so what you have in the Psalms is a third option. The Psalms suggest neither of those things. You don't deny, you don't just vent your emotions, you pray your emotions. And that's what we find in the Psalms. And you bring them before God and you process them in his presence. And for me, those three distinctions, those options, are relatively recent discovery for me. So this is very fresh for me in the last several months as I'm teaching it to you. So go to Psalm 126, New International Version. Here's some vocab words for the series on the book of Psalms. And one of the reasons I throw these up again this week is because this week we don't know who the psalmist is for Psalm 126. And that's often the case. We also don't know the setting. So why was this psalm written? Well, the best guess is that this is after the people of Israel were taken into exile by the Babylonians. And they were in exile for 70 years. And so a lot of people think, a lot of scholars think, this is after they've returned from Babylonian exile. We don't know. That is a really good guess, but we honestly just don't know. But it might be safe to assume, it's something like that was a big deal. So here's a scripture reading of a very brief psalm, Psalm 126. Check it out.
Good morning, Momentum. My name is Jocelyn Crum, and I will be reading Psalm 126 to you all this morning. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dreamed. Our mouths were filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy. Then it was said among the nations, the Lord has done great things. The Lord has done great things for us, and we are filled with joy. Restore our fortunes, Lord, like streams in the Negev. Those who go out weeping, carrying seed to sow, will return with songs of joy, carrying sheaves in the morning. Psalms 126. Have a happy Sunday.
Awesome. Thank you, Jocelyn. So there are two stanzas in this short psalm. The first stanza, verses 1 through 3, the first half. Second stanza, verses 4 through 6. So if you look at the beginning of it, Psalm 126 calls it a song of ascents. There's a group of psalms called they're songs or psalms. It's a word you're meant to mishear. That's are of ascents, and that means that when worshipers were on their way to Jerusalem for some of the annual festivals, where they would do a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, as they were ascending to the elevated city of Jerusalem, they would sing these psalms in anticipation of these festivals or celebrations. So this is one of the seventh of the songs or psalms of ascent. In that grouping. Verse 1, when the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion. Zion is a way to refer to Jerusalem or even all of God's people of Israel. We were like those who dreamed. Our mouths were filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy. Then it was said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us, and we are filled with joy. In fact, in the original Hebrew, this is plural. We're filled with joys, happinesses. Like, this is such a good thing. So, let's assume the best guess is true, that this is after the Babylonian exile, you have to envision the fullness of the trauma that would come from being exiled. So, first they get their butts kicked by the Babylonians. They lose a battle to them. Then their royal families and royal officials are all basically deported to Babylon. And then, that's not to count even the destruction of their capital, Jerusalem, and the destruction of their temple, God's temple where they worshiped in Jerusalem. So the Israelites experienced hardship, bitter disappointment, sorrow, tears. But 70 years later, the people who are still alive and their kids and grandkids are allowed to go back to Jerusalem. And when they go back, they rebuild the city of Jerusalem. They rebuild the temple, and the people of Israel are filled with delirious happiness and joy and relief. But even if this isn't about after the exile, it kind of doesn't matter for our purposes, because whether it was deliverance from famine or a siege or a plague, the point is God did something so big for them that the rest of the nations around them said, man, the Lord has done great things for them. And they also confess that He has done great things for us. Verse 1, it says this, we were like those who dreamed. And all that means is exactly what we think. It was like a dream come true. Like what God did for us, that we would come back to the city of Jerusalem and get to rebuild our temple. Like, we are so relieved. We could hardly dare to believe. It's like a dream come true. Now, I don't know if you've been, in a relationship with God for any amount of time. If church isn't something brand new to you, then maybe you can remember a time where God did something for you that was like spiritually like a dream come true. Like, man, that was so cool. Like, it might have been just simply, I found a church where I knew I could belong. I never thought I could belong in a church. Like, there's church people, like kind of the religious thing I talked about earlier. And then I just thought, I don't fit with that because I'm me and I dress like this. I do this. My personality is this. Whatever it is, it's like a dream come true that I realized church is for me. That's pretty awesome. Or maybe God answered a prayer for you. Or maybe someone you love, and maybe you didn't even have a lot of hope that they would, came to follow Jesus. Maybe you got to baptize them. Whatever it was, maybe you saw a new church launched or a campus of a church launched in opening month, and you were like, man, that was really cool. That was a big deal. Like, it was like I was one of those people who dared to dream something like that because it was like God brought a dream true. Now, there's two stanzas, as I mentioned, and to get into the second one here, both are marked by a similar phrase. Verse 1, the Lord restored the fortunes. So whatever it was that was bad, He made good, and there was delirious joy and excitement and happiness. But then the second stanza also starts with a similar phrase, restore our fortunes, Lord. So what's happening here is the first half of the psalm is a memory of past joy. Like, man, when we came back, for instance, from Babylon, it was unbelievable, so great. And then the second half of the psalm is in tears again. The psalmist is asking God to restore that joy, to restore that kind of happiness. And now it's talking about a desired future. And so my summary of this psalm is this, is in the past, God, you brought us out of sadness, maybe out of the Babylonian exile, and into joy. Right now, we're back in a season of sadness. Give us joy again. Like, we're back in a place. We remember what happiness and joy was like. We're not there. Restore that to us, God. And so when you look through the Psalms, there's 150 of them, and scholars try to categorize them in different genres or groupings, and sometimes it's arbitrary, but there are groupings like this is a psalm of praise or a psalm that's a prayer, or this is a psalm of thanksgiving. But one of those common categories is what's called a lamentation. And that just means it's a psalmist lamenting, crying, weeping. It's full of sorrow and grief. And this psalm is a communal lamentation. It's us saying, man, we're in a sad place. Please restore joy to us again. Now, there's two interesting images that are pretty beautiful that are in the second half of the psalm, and really what the psalm kind of lands on and what it's all about. The first is a picture of revival of joy. These both are. The first is rain during a dry season. And so verse 4 says, restore our fortunes, Lord, like streams in the Negev. And really what that means is this. So the Negev is a barren desert area in South Israel. In fact, the word Negev itself means dry or parched. And so in verse 4, what the psalmist is doing is acknowledging, man, we're in a dry season. Can you relate to that? We're in a dry season. Like, our lives are like a desert right now. We don't have happiness or joy at all. And so he's acknowledging, man, we're in this dry place. Our lives are like a desert. We're in a dry season. So ultimately, the Negev, it's interesting because they have these dry riverbeds that just look like gashes in the landscape. Like, that doesn't look like it is a riverbed. It just looks like some gash at times. Like, why would that be here in the middle of a desert? And so in the Negev, they're wadis, these dry riverbeds. These wadis in the summer, totally bone dry. But then all of a sudden, the people that live in that area or have experienced this in the area will say in the winter, when some rain comes, it'll be all of a sudden like this flood of a river in these wadis will come flooding through. And the next morning, picture this, there will be green grass and flowers all around. It's crazy. This barren desert. Then the winter rains come, which is super rare. And they come through, whoosh, next day, green grass and beautiful flowers. And so the image here of this first metaphor of the revival of joy is really about the happiness or joy that comes suddenly, and it's an absolute gift from God. Like, it just is, God just blesses you in some way, and you're like, man, that was incredible. It might be, again, I didn't expect to, but I found a church where I could grow spiritually, or I met this person at Momentum or in my Mo group, and man, I just connect with them. I want to hang out with them. I want to eat with them. I feel encouraged spiritually by them. They kind of get me fired up. They help me when I'm struggling. And that kind of new friendship, it was a gift from God. It just kind of feels like it was just dropped in my lap out of nowhere. Or maybe you find a sweet spot for one of your passions, and you're like, man, this really fulfills me to serve God and to serve others in this way. So sometimes happiness is just a sudden gift, an absolute blessing from God. But here's the next image. The next image says this, and this is the end of the psalm. Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy. Those who go out weeping, carrying seed to sow, will return with songs of joy, carrying sheaves or bundles of the harvest with them. Now, this is a really cool image also. The second image is of farmers going out to sow or plant seeds. And they go out and they put the seeds in the ground, and, crops for us typically around here, the kind of crops we would see often take 60 to 100 days before they're ready to be harvested. And so there's a harvest, and then people gather up the sheaves, in this case, and they would go home rejoicing. And so you'll notice that the second image is slow, hard, arduous work, right? It's not just like, and the rains came, and God gave me the gift of a person or a group or a community or a gift or a passion, anything like that. It's totally different. The image is slow, hard work, painstaking work, and God assigns human beings a role in this image. Like, God is like, I'm providing the soil and the rain, but I'm also going to ask that you do day-to-day work and you roll up your sleeves to receive these sheaves of joy. And so people get to work in cooperation with God and the rain that he provides, and this kind of joy and happiness is hard-won and long-awaited, and it's a long game. It really, really is. So this is a poetic image, and I think this is really beautiful, and this is what it means. Now, poetry is meant to evoke. Like, you can look at something and be like, what does that mean? You do that sometimes with pop songs. You're like, what does that mean? Most pop songs aren't poetry. They're crap. But, sometimes a pop song, like, what are they talking about there? Oh, I think Taylor Swift's talking about her beef with this girl, that kind of thing. But that's the deal with poetry, is you're often left like it's to evoke. What does that mean? Well, there's two things this could mean, and the Hebrew is purposefully ambiguous. One thing it could mean is these farmers are going out in this poetry, and they're planting their tears in the soil. And they leave with sheaves of joy after a long time, after cultivating and day-to-day hard work. The other thing it could mean is the farmers are going out and they're planting seed, but their tears are watering the seed. It's a really beautiful image. So tears are water, and water produces, life has the ability to give life, to produce grass and flowers and crops and harvest and fruit and sheaves. And so the tears are being planted, basically. Dr. Walter Zorn, who is a professor emeritus at Lincoln Christian University, says of verse 5, he says, this is one of the most beautiful phrases in the Psalms. If you're in a dry season right now, I'd recommend memorizing this beautiful little phrase from the Psalms. Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy. And I'll explain more what that means, but that's just such a beautiful verse in the Psalter. And so the second image, what you have is you are in cooperation with God to harvest sheaves of joy. Sometimes it's a blessing of rain that just whoosh, and you're like, man, oh, it's so incredible. It's like a dream come true. Other times it's, okay, God isn't just doing that. I'm going to get to work in cooperation with him, and I'm going to go plant these tears. I'm going to go sow tears or water seeds with my tears. And that might mean you have to start saying, I'm going to daily pray like these Psalms. I'm daily going to talk to God. I'm daily going to get into his word, and I'm going to do the hard work of learning how God created me, how my soul works, what he has done for me to save me, and all this stuff. I'm going to get involved in a community, and luckily Mo groups are starting up this week, because one of the works that you do in cooperation with God, if you are in a dry season, you need a spiritual community. You need people around you that can inspire you, help you learn, help you grow, help you hear from the scriptures, and also tell you things that you need to hear in truth and love. Martin Luther, the great reformer, he struggled with depression a lot. Kind of makes sense because he was a priest who really thought he was doing a good job of asking questions that needed to be discussed within the Catholic Church. He didn't tack up the 95 Thesis to say, hey, come at me, bruh. He was like, hey, I think these are things to be discussed. And it kind of went viral, and he didn't see it coming. And the printing press, which was a new thing at that time, made this go viral. And he was like, whoa, I didn't see this. I wasn't trying to pick a fight. I was saying we should discuss these problems in the church. So the Pope wants to kill him. He's depressed a lot, which makes a lot of sense. He's always teaching as a heavy load. So he struggled with depression on and off. And there's a story told that one of the times he was struggling with depression, he'd been moping around for 3 days in his house. Wasn't connecting with his friends. He's just moping around, woe is me, muttering under his breath. So one day his wife came down to dinner dressed in all black, kind of like me right now. She came down dressed in all black. And he said, who died? And she said, well, God, obviously. And he said, what are you talking about? God didn't die. And she said, well, then act like it. And they both burst out into laughter because he realized how he was acting. He was just moping around in self-pity. And here's the deal. First off, a strong, godly, tell it like it is woman is just a beautiful gift. I mean, not that I know. I wouldn't know how this objectively I'm saying. Okay. But, I mean, do you really literally believe that God can work with you to bring you and restore happiness and joy? If so, then sometimes the message you have to hear is, then act like it. Do something about it. Get to work in cooperation with God and take some action steps to grow spiritually so that you can get back to one of those seasons of happiness and joy and being filled up. Take action, put in the work. So when the psalmist is telling us this in the psalm, one of the things this psalm is teaching us is this, is it is possible to waste your sorrows by grieving in a way that doesn't produce any fruit at all. Okay, this is a really important point. It is possible to waste your sorrows. It's possible to just say, and this is a very typical kind of American, shallow, secular society kind of way to respond. Say, I got to get through this season. I got to get through this sadness. or past seasons of sadness. I don't want to think about those. I want to put them out of my mind and just say I did get through that. It's possible for you to waste your sorrows by grieving in a way that doesn't produce any kind of growth or fruit or anything. Let me say it again. It's possible to waste your sorrows. Okay? And so the first thing you have to do to not waste your sorrows, there's kind of two things from this last verse, these last two verses, this last metaphor, is there's two things you can do. The first thing you have to do is you have to pray your tears. And that's a theme through the Psalms. We're praying our emotions. This is that third God-given option on how to deal with your feelings. So pray your tears. Your sadness, no matter whether you're introverted or you're a dude and you're a manly man and blah, 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 your sadness is not meant to remain in the deep recesses of your heart where you refuse to admit them or express them. That's not what you were created for. And I'm all for talking to friends about your sadness or whatever. What I'm not about and what the scriptures aren't about is you venting or complaining or gossiping to your friends if your sadness is caused by someone else, okay? But venting to God, that's what you were created for, to vent those emotions to God. And I'm all about talking to a counselor. I'm all about saying, I need to talk this out. So yes, that is all good. But ultimately, where your tears belong is not in some managed, packaged, manicured little confessional prayer. They belong in pre-reflective outbursts that you pour out to God from the very depths of your being in the presence of God. To say, this is what the point of prayer is, or one of the points of prayer, is for me to bring my emotions raw, pre-cooked to God. And to say, God, this is what I'm feeling. This is what I'm going through. And one of the things that we've been encouraging through this series is to ask God, what do you want for me instead? Of this emotion, this negative emotion I'm struggling through, what do you want for me instead? What do you want for me instead of, for instance, wasting my sorrows? What do you want for me instead, God? And so your instead, we're going to repeat, isn't the opposite, because we said this last week. It isn't always the opposite. It might be sometimes, but it isn't always the opposite of the negative emotion. So it might be that God says to you, instead of sadness, contentment. Instead of sadness, community. Instead of sadness, freshness. Realizing that you're in a new chapter that you're not even recognizing right now, that there's a new chapter in your life or in society or whatever it is. Or instead of sadness, songs of praise. And that might be a sacrifice of praise right now, but what I want for you, it might be praise. And so in the midst of my morning, I'm going to learn that instead of sadness, I'm going to praise God. And so here's the other thing you do. So first you you pray your tears, and the second one is that you plant your tears. And that means you see your sorrow as an opportunity for growth and fruitfulness. Don't waste your sorrow. Plant your tears and see that as an opportunity for growth and for beauty and for multiplication and sheaves of joy that can be harvested from that. So what does that mean? Well, when Shannon and I had been married for a few years, we were about 5.5 years into our marriage before we kind of realized, hey, we haven't been trying to prevent a pregnancy for quite a while now, and we're not getting pregnant. And for the first time, we had to start speaking the word infertility, like, man, this has been a really long time. And I'm kind of upbeat, positive. Usually I was like, that's not a big deal. It'll just God's timing, blah, 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 preacher talk. Like it'll work out. We'll figure it out. Well, Shannon begins grieving, and later on I would catch up. But she was like, we got to figure out, why are we not having children? Like, why are we not getting pregnant and all that stuff? And so Shannon read a book, and man, does it have an awful title. But this is what it's called. It's Empty Womb, Aching Heart. Oh my gosh. And so it's written by this lady named Marlowe, and she wrote this book that was just like, oh man, this is gut-wrenching. And so I read the book after her, and she told me about it, and I read it as a way to begin my grieving process also, but also partly just to support her, because she was ahead of me in the grieving process. And so basically, like here, this is my copy of the book from back in the day. If you're close enough, you might see it's water damaged, like really badly. Those are from my tears. oh my gosh, this book. So it's a compilation of 24 chapters that are all stories, testimonies written in the first person by different people, men and women, who have struggled with infertility in some kind of way or another. And so I read it and just was like, man, this is really, really powerful. And as I went through the stories, the first testimony is about a woman who was 37 years old named Megan. And Megan talked about how she'd go shopping at the grocery store. And in a lighthearted way, she talked about, I'm trying to find the toilet paper that's the cheapest. And I'm like, okay, this is a 4-pack, double layered. That's 10 cents cheaper than that one. So she grabs a couple and throws them in her cart. She says, and then she turns around and all of a sudden, she sees a baby staring at her. And it has the same color eyes as her husband and the same color hair as her, but it's on the front of a Charmin package. And she's like, whoa. And she said next thing she knew, she was looking around and seeing packages of diapers. And the title of that chapter is Crying in the Diaper Aisle. Because all of a sudden she looked around, she started seeing these babies on diaper packages, and they weren't able to have kids, and they're trying to get pregnant, had been for a while. And so this book, she says, when she saw the picture of that baby, she said, my hands clenched the cart handle, my throat tightened, my vision blurred, tears pooled in my eyes and began to trickle down my cheeks. And this whole book is full of stories of people, women with severe endometriosis, men with not so perfect sperm, couples who had multiple miscarriages together, and on and on and on. Wives who struggle with terrible thoughts like, I'm a baby-making factory that doesn't work. And then awful comments that they had to endure from friends and family and loved ones that said things like, well, God knows who should be a mother and who shouldn't. Maybe God knows you wouldn't be a good mother. Not everyone's cut out for the job, Wow, but I might be good at strangling. My thumbs are really straight. Wah! Like, what in the world? And so, no mercy. And so, what did they do with their tears, though? Like, this book is a compilation of people who decided to plant their tears. Like, this is, I'm filled with sorrow. No one wants to write a book whose name is Empty Womb, Aching Heart. But Marlowe and many men and women inside of this book said, I'm not going to waste my sorrows. I'm going to plant my tears, and I'm going to believe that my story, my testimony, if I use it to serve other people, to comfort other people, to help other people heal, then if I do that, I'm going to reap sheaves of joy. And so, for me, I struggled with pornography. Before I became a Christian, I was addicted to it. But when I became a Christian, I stayed addicted to it. I didn't know how to break the pattern. All the porn in the house was my stepdad's at a time where it was hard copy porn and not, on a keyboard. And so I was like, I don't know how to fight this, how to battle this. I got married, and I still struggled. And finally, one day, I opened up and confessed this. And all this grieving and the heartbreak of telling my wife that I've been addicted to pornography, the way it broke her heart, the way it broke my heart, the way I wanted freedom from it. But I didn't want that to become my story that I had to share with people. But eventually I was talking to guys, and sharing with guys once I was public about it. Like, man, how did you find freedom from that, which has been since 2001, 2002? Like, how did you do that? What was the process? And here's the deal. She doesn't want to write a book called Empty Womb, Aching Heart. I don't want to be an apostle to the perverts. But that's often what God uses is your weakness. How are you broken? How have you cried? And plant your tears and say, man, I believe that if I share my story, if I look for people to comfort, if I'll be honest about how Jesus rescued me from this or brought me through this dry season, then there'll be sheaves of joy in that will come out the other end of that, because it's being used to comfort and to relieve and to serve or minister, which means really just to serve God and others in the name of Jesus. And so to do that for people who are hurting. In fact, this goes along with what a lot of psychologists or therapists will tell you, is that sometimes you might be sad in a way that eventually your therapist might tell you, man, you are starting to wallow in self-pity. What you need to do is serve someone, right? You need to find someone to serve. And they might mean go build a house for Habitat for Humanity, which is good, but they just mean you have to remember your story's not the only story. You are so focused on your sadness, you're becoming self-centered. You're wallowing in self-pity. So go do something outside of yourself. And that's exactly what these guys did. they planted their tears. They said, maybe my story will help out someone. And my guess is several of them shared that story at their church. And several of them have shared that story with another single person who hoped to be married but never was. And therefore, they never biologically had a child, or whatever. And so there's all these ways where they share their stories. They say, I'm going to plant my tears. And that's my ministering to other people is going to reap sheaves of joy. Malcolm Gladwell, famous author, brilliant dude. He wrote a book called David and Goliath a few years ago. And one of the things he says inside of that, he's talking about how a lot of kids that grow up and become geniuses, a lot of them in their stories lost a parent or both parents. And he's like, there's this weird correlation between that happening. It's almost like the adversity, made them struggle and dig through and just like become who they were. And it's something that we'd say, wow, that person's a genius. They're like, yeah, well, some of this came from the fact that I was on my own and I had to fight through this. So Malcolm Gladwell says this. He says, no one wants their children to go through something awful, but as a society, don't we need people who have emerged from some kind of trauma? Clearly we do. And so does the church. Like, God didn't give you the sad thing that you're going through now or that you've been through so that you could just waste your sorrow. God allowed that to happen, and you've come through that, and now you have an opportunity, if you follow Jesus, and it was by faith that all this happened, to say, now I can plant my tears. And the community, the church needs that, to know there are other people here who have been through this, and they're willing to speak to me, comfort me, start a Mo group that's about this thing, and we together travel this road, but it's a road where we reap sheaves of joy out of tears being planted. Late Christian author Bob Buford, he said, my fruit grows on other people's trees. And what he means is I try to mentor and disciple people, even if that's sorrows. You will apply this to us. Even if that's our sorrows, that when you go through something terrible, painful, then it's time to not just focus inward eventually and say, how can I help my fruit grow in other people's trees? I'm going to plant my tears, and I'm going to minister to other people with my pain and my sorrow. I'm going to use this and not waste my sorrow. And I know so many stories, but there's some football games on today. I mean, I could just go on and on. I know people who have been addicts, drug addicts, alcoholics, all that stuff, who have said, you know what, that's not the thing I want to spend my life talking about necessarily, but I feel like I'm supposed to lead an AA group or a Celebrate Recovery group, which is a ministry for recovery. And I feel like that's what I'm supposed to do because I'm going to plant my tears. I know a couple that went through an affair. One cheated on the other, and they started to work through that, and they grieved that together, and they went through the hard work of reconciliation. And in that process, they both became Christians. Years later, there was a couple at Momentum who was struggling through some infidelity and struggling with their marriage and relationship. And this other couple spoke up and said, hey, we don't want to broadcast this to the world, to the church. No one would ever really guess this was in our story, but it is. And if that couple would like someone to talk to, we'd be willing to get together once a week, once a month, whatever it is, and really share how we got through that together. And how Jesus is now the center of our marriage and makes a huge difference in why we have a happy marriage. They're planting their tears. And it's huge because from that, it produces sheaves of joy. And so maybe for you, God is telling you, instead of wasting your sorrows, instead of being self-centered with your grief, and yes, you got to go through a grief cycle, no doubt, but if you're caught in your grief, instead of that, you have to eventually get to a point where you say, maybe God's saying to you, I want you to invest, to plant, to sow. Invest would be a more modern word, to invest your tears. So instead of sadness, sowing. Instead of sadness, service. Instead of sadness, self-sacrifice. Instead of sadness, sheaves of joy. This is what God might be saying to you this morning about whatever has caused you sorrow. So how is God calling you to plant your tears from your deepest sorrows? Because weeping doesn't have to be the end of the story, just like it's not in Psalm 126. Now, as I said earlier, I think it's really interesting that when you're working out, you can't work out your heart directly. You always have to work out your heart indirectly, through your legs, through your arms and shoulders, through your whole body with swimming or whatever. And I think that's really interesting because I've been thinking about this a whole bunch, mostly during walks, during quarantine, where I couldn't talk to any of you and I had to just go for walks, and so that's what I do. I just go walking now. I don't have friends or people that I can see. I go walking, and I think about these kind of things. And I think it's really similar in the search for joy and happiness. It's a very similar situation. You can't go after joy directly. You can't build up your joy directly. You kind of have to go about building up your happiness indirectly. I mean, think about this with me. If you chase happiness directly, you are going to be miserable. I've tried it. I've had seasons, dry seasons, where I've been like, God, I want to be happy again. Like, I'm not typically a default, melancholy, bummed out. I want to be happy again. Restore me, God. Like, I want happiness. But if I chased happiness, I would be more miserable because I'm chasing happiness. And ultimately what will happen is you'll become a hedonist if you chase joy, if you chase happiness. So to get to happiness, you have to go indirectly. To get to happiness and joy, you have to chase something else. And this is going to blow your mind. Guess what it is? To get to happiness and joy, you have to chase Jesus. You have to love God and chase Jesus and his truth and grace. You have to love God. And guess what else you have to do? Going to blow your mind. Love people. You have to say, I've got to serve others with my sorrows and often out of your weakness. The last thing in the world that you want to talk about, I am going to plant my tears. I'm going to pray my tears and plant my tears, and I'm going to use this as a ministry to serve others. You got to get your mind off yourself, your therapist says. God says the same thing in this situation. You got to love others, and that's a way that you reap sheaves of joy by indirectly. You indirectly work out your human heart by chasing after Jesus, loving God, loving others. So we have the only faith in the world that claims that God came to the earth, and you know what we call him? The man of sorrows. That's what Scripture calls him. And the reason for that is we look at the cross and we see Jesus take on all of our sin and all of the sorrows of sinfulness against one another and all that. Jesus takes that all on himself, and he cries out to the Father, why me? And ultimately he says, Father, why have you forsaken me? Why me? And because Jesus did that, we will never cry out, why me the same? Because what Jesus did was, he knows what it's like to look up to and to shout up to the Father and feel like heaven is barred, feel like heaven's closed to him. And so to feel nothing, to cry out and feel nothing in response. And so Jesus called for God, and he ultimately got the abandonment that we deserved because of our sin. And he took our sorrows and our sin on his shoulders. But ultimately, what Jesus did, being a man of sorrows, produced joy. Hebrews 12 says this, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. Knowing the joy that he would bring you if you would put faith in him, knowing the sheaves of joy that he would produce in your life, why did he go to the cross? Why did he do that? He did it for the joy set before him. He knew the joy he would bring to you and to me and to the world if he endured the sorrow of the cross. So Jesus, you could say it this way, he went out weeping, planting tears, but 3 days later he returned carrying sheaves of joy for you and for me. Let's pray.